Let's practice some transformations. Now, the good news for all of this is we have the same 4 transformations we had from 2.1. Amplitude, vertical shift, period, phase shift. And they're all in the same place. So amplitude is multiplying in front. Vertical shift is adding or subtracting at the end. Period is multiplying inside. And we still do 2 pi over that number to get our period. If you remember from 2.1, this number in here is technically our frequency. And we do 2 pi over that number to get our period. And then phase shift is adding or subtracting inside, which is none. And we still graph these in the same order. So first is our vertical shift. That's none, so that stays on the x-axis. Next is our amplitude, up 3, down 3. Next is our phase shift. That's none, so that stays on the y-axis. And then our period is out to pi. So I'm going to do pi out to here. Remember that you can choose how to label your tick marks. This is how I'm choosing to put them. And now for the shape. Step 5 is where we look at the shape. Now this is a secant graph, which means this is going to be a cosine wave flipped. So I'm going to start by drawing a cosine wave in my boxes. So cosine starts at the top, works down to the bottom, and works back up to the top. But instead of fully drawing this cosine wave in, I am just going to do it with dots, with dashes. So there's my cosine wave. Now what I'm going to do is flip it. So any point that crosses your orange vertical shift line, that becomes an asymptote. So this is going to be one of my asymptotes. That's a point that crosses my orange vertical shift line. And this is an asymptote that crosses my orange vertical shift line. And now I'm going to flip the pieces in between. So I've got this part here. I'm going to flip it to look like this. This part I'm going to flip to look like this. And the last part I'm going to flip to look like that. And remember, we always need at least 2 waves. So let's go out to 2 pi. So I can do another wave out here. And same thing. We're going to graph the cosine wave, the C, with our dashed lines. Anything that crosses our orange vertical shift line becomes an asymptote. And then we just flip the pieces in between. And there we go. That's our graph. So we graphed everything exactly the same. We even had our cosine waves, the exact same as we did in 2.1. The only thing we added at the end was flipping the cosine wave to get the secant wave. That is the only extra thing. Now, let's list where our asymptotes are. The easiest way to do that, find the first asymptote. So it looks like the first one is right here at pi fourths. Plus, let's see, the next asymptote is right here at 3 pi fourths. So it looks like they're pi halves apart. To get from this one to this one, I add pi halves. To get from this one to the next one, I add pi halves and keep going. So plus pi halves k. Oops, and I should have been more exact with this. Asymptotes are always x equals. And that gives us all of our asymptotes. So now that we've done an example together, I want you to try to do B. So once again, do the exact same steps we've been doing this whole time, but this time you're going to graph a sine wave and then flip the sine wave. So try this on your own and then come back to check your work and see how you did. Let's check your work. So first off, I did my vertical shift up 2. There's my vertical shift line. My amplitude is then up 1 and down 1 from that vertical shift line. My phase shift was right pi fourths, so I decided to make one box pi fourths and went to the right 1. And then my period is 2 pi, so then I went out 2 pi more to get my next line. So pi fourths plus 2 pi gives me that line. And then all I needed to do was fit my sine wave to it. So there's my sine wave. Now, any point that crosses your orange vertical shift line becomes an asymptote. So here's an asymptote, crosses the orange vertical shift line. Here's an asymptote, crosses the orange vertical shift line. And here's an asymptote, crosses the orange vertical shift line. And then I just take the parts in between my asymptotes and flip them directions. And then I did another wave over here, flipped, and that gave me my cosecant graph. Now my first asymptote's at pi fourths, and all the asymptotes are pi apart. So pi fourths plus pi k gives me my asymptotes. So maybe you missed a couple small things. That's totally fine. Let's take that and try another one. So this one, don't forget any time that you have a period inside, you need to separate it. So this is actually going to be x plus pi thirds, because then I can think of distributing that 1/2 and I get that. But if you don't separate it, it'll mess up your phase shift. So go ahead, pause the video, try this one this time, list all your things. And notice that this time it's a secant, so it's going to be the cosine wave flipped. Pause the video, try this one out to come back, and then see if you can do better than you did on the last one. Let's check your work. This one, no vertical shift, so I left it on the x-axis. Amplitude up 1, down 1. Now for this phase shift, I know I had to go right pi thirds. However, I knew my period is really big, 4 pi. So because the period is so big, I decided to make one box 1 pi. So then that way it would be really easy to go out to 4 pi. So if I want to go right pi thirds, that's just 1/3 pi, or 1/3 of a box. So that yellow line right there is right 1/3 pi. Then I go out 4 pi, so I go 1/3 past 4 pi, gives me the end. And now I fit my cosine wave to this, because it's secant, which is cosine flipped. So notice that I fit my cosine wave in between those lines. And then, of course, I did a second cosine wave, because that's what we're supposed to do. Then anywhere it crosses the orange vertical shift line, I made an asymptote. And then I flipped the pieces in between to get my secant graph. Now I noticed where my asymptotes are. I have an asymptote right here at 4 pi thirds, and all the asymptotes are 2 pi apart. You could also say that one of your asymptotes is negative 2 pi thirds plus 2 pi k. Either one is totally fine, but that gives us our asymptotes. Okay, One last problem for this video. Hopefully you did a little better on the last one than the first one that you tried on your own. Here is your last chance. Let's try this one more time and see how you do this time. See if we can try and get this one perfectly right with everything that we've learned. Now, remember to find all your things, and this is a cosecant graph, so it's going to be a sine wave flipped. Pause the video, try this last one out on your own, and then come back to see how you did. Let's see how you did. No vertical shift, so that stays on the x-axis. Amplitude is up 2, down 2. Phase shift, I went left 3, so that took me to there. Period was 8, so next I went 8 over, and that was my next period line. This is a sine flipped, so I made my sine wave. And of course, I made a second one right there. Anywhere that crosses the orange vertical shift line becomes an asymptote. And then I flip the pieces in the middle, in between those asymptotes, to get my cosecant graph. And that is all we're going to do for sine, secant, and cosecant. Now, before I end this video, one last pattern I want you to notice is the number next to k for each of our asymptotes. You might have already noticed that the number next to k is always half of the period. So this is pi, but the period was 2 pi. This one's 2 pi because the period was 4 pi. This one is 4 and the period was 8. That only works for secant and cosecant graphs, but it is a little pattern you can remember if that helps. If not, you can always just graph them out and see where those red asymptotes end up, and that's where they're at. So that is all we have for secant and cosecant. In the next video, we'll do the other half of our lesson, which is looking at tangent and cotangent.